At the end of the third episode of Band of Brothers, the story of Private Albert Blythe appears to be over. After following him through fear, temporary blindness, and a sniper's bullet in Normandy, the episode leaves viewers with one final statement. Blythe never recovered from his wounds and died in 1948. That statement is wrong. Albert Blythe recovered. He returned to the United States Army, served again during the Korean War era, rose to the rank of Master Sergeant, and remained on active duty until his real death in West Germany in 1967. His grave at Arlington National Cemetery proves that he lived 19 years beyond the ending seen by millions. But the most unsettling part is not that a television series printed the wrong year. It is that Blythe's own comrades, a best-selling history, and one of the most respected war dramas ever made, somehow lost almost half of his adult life. So what really happened to Albert Blythe after Normandy? And how did a living American soldier become a dead man in his own story? To understand why the mistake carried so much weight, it helps to remember how Band of Brothers presents him. Corentin is built around a question rarely shown so openly in war stories. What happens when a trained soldier reaches combat and discovers that fear can overpower his body? Blythe is not introduced as a natural battlefield legend. He is disoriented after the D-Day jump. He struggles to find his unit. After the fighting around Corentin, his vision fails, even though his eyes have not been physically injured. The condition was then commonly described as hysterical blindness, but would now be understood as a physical symptom produced by extreme psychological stress. Major Richard Winters later said the underlying event was real. Blythe had become so frightened that he mentally shut down. Winters encountered him at an aid stations, spoke to him, and believed that the exchange helped pull him back. That matters because the series did not invent Blythe's fear. What it did was allow that fear, and the wound that followed, to become almost the entire meaning of his life. The real Albert Blythe had landed in Normandy with Easy Company after training at Camp Toccoa. Like many paratroopers on June 6, 1944, he came down far from the intended drop zone. He eventually joined other scattered airborne soldiers and found his way back toward his unit. He had already survived the jump, the confusion of the night, and the fighting for Corentin. Then, after recovering from the episode of blindness, Blythe did something that complicates the image of a man paralyzed by fear. He volunteered. On June 25, 1944, Blythe's 21st birthday, Easy Company was operating outside Corentin when men were needed to examine a suspicious farmhouse. Blythe went forward with the patrol. A German sniper's bullet struck him in the upper right shoulder near the collarbone. The difference between shoulder and neck may sound small. It is not. On screen, the wound looks like the beginning of a slow death. In reality, it was serious enough to remove him from the European campaign, but it was not fatal. Blythe was evacuated into the military hospital system. He did not return to Easy Company before the war ended, and that physical separation would eventually become the first link in the chain that erased him. But the Army did not record a man dying in 1948. It recorded a wounded soldier who continued through a long recovery and was released from Army hospital care in October 1945. That is the first major answer to the mystery. Albert Blythe did not linger for 4 years and die from the sniper's bullet. He survived it, returned home, and began rebuilding his life. If you enjoy discovering what the movies and series left out of real military history, subscribe to Forgotten War Stories. Because for Albert Blythe, surviving Normandy was only the end of the first chapter. The next decision is what makes the false ending so extraordinary. He chose to become a soldier again. The easiest version of Blythe's story is the one television gives us. A young man reaches war, fear overwhelms him, and a bullet closes the tragedy. The true version is less tidy. Blythe was afraid. He also returned to combat after that fear. He experienced temporary blindness. He also volunteered to move toward a position where an enemy sniper was waiting. Neither fact cancels the other. That is what Richard Winters believed the popular version treated unfairly. The problem was not showing Blythe frightened. The problem was leaving audiences with no chance to see what he did after fear. His conduct on June 25th offers the first correction. A soldier who had frozen under the strain of battle volunteered for a patrol and moved ahead of cover. His life after the war offers the larger one. Back in Philadelphia, Blythe worked for Westinghouse Electric. For a time, the Army could have remained something that happened to him when he was 19. A brutal chapter marked by a Purple Heart, and months of hospitals. Instead, in March 1949, he re-enlisted. This was not a man who had nowhere else to go because the war was still underway. Germany had surrendered almost 4 years earlier. Blithe had returned to civilian employment. He knew what airborne service demanded because he had already paid for it with blood, and he went back anyway. When war began in Korea in 1950, Blithe's life moved in the opposite direction from the ending later attached to his name. He served with the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team, one of the Army's principal airborne formations connected to the Korean conflict. Richard Winters later spoke with admiration about Blithe's service with the 187th and the decorations associated with it. Surviving family materials also preserve a career that continued through airborne assignments long after World War II. The exact public accounts of every medal in action do not agree in all details, but the larger record is unmistakable. The private supposedly dying from his Normandy wound was back in uniform. He was again serving with American airborne troops, and he did not stop when Korea ended. Blithe later served with the 82nd Airborne Division and with the Military Assistance Advisory Group in Taiwan. He married. He and his wife Kay raised a son and a daughter. He advanced through the enlisted ranks until Private First Class Albert Blithe of Easy Company became Master Sergeant Albert Blithe. That transformation is the real payoff hidden behind the incorrect date. The series did not merely subtract 19 years from his life. It erased the years in which he proved that the worst moments shown in Carentan did not define him. But this creates another question. If Blithe was serving in recognizable American units, raising a family, and eventually stationed in Europe, how could the men of Easy Company believe he was dead? The answer begins with the way wartime units break apart. Easy Company is remembered as a brotherhood, and rightly so. But after Blithe was wounded, he disappeared into hospitals while the company continued fighting across Europe. The men moved on to the Netherlands, Bastogne, Germany, and Austria. Replacements arrived, others were wounded, transferred, or killed. Letters were filled to follow men whose assignments changed. By the time the survivors returned home, the unit that had once occupied the same barracks at Tokwa was scattered across the country. Blithe did attend an early reunion of the 101st Airborne Division Association, but Easy Company eventually lost contact with him. That gap was filled by memory. Some of his former comrades believed the sniper had struck him in the neck. They remembered him leaving the company with a grave wound. Later, they came to believe that he had never recovered and had died in 1948. There was no malicious attempt to steal his future. The men supplying the story believed they were honoring a dead comrade. But memory becomes dangerous when uncertainty disappears from the retelling. Decades later, historian Stephen Ambrose built Band of Brothers largely from interviews with Easy Company veterans. Their testimony gave the book its intimacy and power. It also carried the limitations of human recollection. The false account surrounding Blithe entered the accepted history and then reached an audience far larger than any wartime reunion ever could. When HBO adapted the story, the mistake acquired something memory alone never possessed: an image, a soundtrack, and a final card that looked authoritative. The screen did not say the men believed Blithe had died. It told the audience that he had, and for millions of viewers, that became the end of Albert Blithe. The truth was not hidden in a sealed intelligence file. It was visible in the life Blithe had continued to live. There were military assignments after World War II. There were photographs of an older Blithe in uniform. There was a wife, 2 children, and a son who knew that his father had not died 3 years before he was born. There was also a grave. In December 1967, Master Sergeant Albert Blithe was serving with the 8th Supply and Transport Battalion of the 8th Infantry Division in West Germany. Shortly before his death, he returned from a commemorative visit to Bastogne, the place forever connected to Easy Company's most famous battle. He became ill and was admitted to the hospital in Wiesbaden with a perforated ulcer. Surgery could not save him. Complications followed, and Blithe died on December 17, 1967, at the age of 44. He was still on active duty. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery in Section 31, grave 7672. That is where the two endings finally collide. The television card says 1948 after a life supposedly destroyed by Normandy. The headstone says 1967 after 25 years connected to the United States Army. One ending reduces him to a wound, the other records a career. Correcting this story does not require dismissing Band of Brothers. The series captured something real and uncomfortable in Albert Blithe. Combat fear can take physical control of a person, even after training, even among elite troops, and even when that person desperately wants to function. Winters himself confirmed that Blythe's breakdown was not fiction. The episode also understands that courage is not the absence of fear. Blythe returned to the line. He volunteered for the patrol. That part of the story deserves to remain. Where the series fails him is in allowing one period of terror and one bullet wound to become a complete biography. It places the wound in the neck rather than the shoulder. More importantly, it presents an incorrect death as settled fact and denies viewers the transformation that came afterward. The man depicted as barely surviving his first war chose airborne service again. The private became a master sergeant. The patient became a career soldier. The supposedly dead man raised a family and remained in uniform until 1967. Even the men who had remembered him incorrectly were not dishonoring him on purpose. Their mistake reveals something larger about military history. The closer a story feels to eyewitness memory, the easier it is to forget that eyewitnesses can lose contact, combine events, or repeat information they never had the chance to verify. The Brotherhood was real. So was the distance created by war. Albert Blithe's son, Gordon, later said that he wanted his father remembered as a true American paratrooper, someone who risked his life for people he did not know. That memory makes room for the frightened young man in Normandy. It simply refuses to end with him. Blithe was not less courageous because fear once overwhelmed him. His later choices make the moment more human, not less heroic. He knew exactly what war could do to a soldier. He knew what it felt like to lose control of his own sight. He knew the sound of the bullet that ended his first campaign, and after recovering, he put on the uniform again. At the end of Carrington, Band of Brothers gives Albert Blithe a death. The historical record gives him something more important, the rest of his life. He did not die in 1948. He returned, he served, and for 19 more years, the soldier the world was told to mourn was still writing his own story. If Band of Brothers got Blithe wrong, what did Saving Private Ryan change? Click the video on your screen to discover the truth.